Welcome to our conversation with author Sarah Marie Wiebe as we talk about her new book, Hot Mess: Mothering Through a Code Red Climate Emergency. We're going to structure this event into three parts. First, Sarah will share a presentation talking about some of the context for her writing the book and the themes within it. And then she and I will have a conversation about the book. And then the third part of the call will be an open audience Q&A where we will invite folks to write your questions in the chat. Now, for the folks joining from Ottawa, from the big room, if I don't know how easy it is for you to type questions in the chat, so we can figure out a way to maybe you can come off mute and ask your questions that way, if that's better for you. If you could please wait until the Q&A section to put your questions in the chat, that will just help us with managing the flow of questions. And okay, so let's get started. I'm going to introduce Dr. Sarah Marie Wiebe. Thank you, Sarah, for being here. Dr. Sarah Marie Wiebe grew up on unceded Coast Salish territory in British Columbia. She's the mother of a 3-year-old and author of the recently published book, Hot Mess: Mothering Through a Code Red Climate Emergency. Sarah is also an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria and an adjunct professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, as well as the co-founder of the Feminist Environmental Research Network Collaborative, which has the lovely acronym FERN. Her research focuses on community development and environmental sustainability. As a collaborative researcher and filmmaker, she worked with Indigenous communities on sustainability-themed films, including To Fish as Formerly. She collaborated with artists from Attawapiskat on a project entitled Reimagining Attawapiskat, which is a companion website to her book, Life Against States of Emergency: Revitalizing Treaty Relations from Attawapiskat. Sarah is also the author of Everyday Exposure: Indigenous Mobilization and Environmental Justice in Canada's Chemical Valley. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm so delighted to be joining this community and speaking with you. And I actually completed my PhD at the University of Ottawa, so it feels really special to be co-hosted by the community out there in Ottawa-Gatineau area. It looks like a really lovely space there. So thank you very much. And I've actually had the opportunity as well to connect with some of the For Our Kids community members in Victoria, where I live, and attend a mending workshop, which was so wonderful. I was so thrilled to go to work the next day wearing 3 things I had mended the day before. So that was really, really delightful. It's such a wonderful community. So I'm really thrilled to learn about it and to be able to speak with you today, and delighted that many of you have had the chance to read this book and engage with some of these ideas. So I am going to share with you a little bit about who I am, how this book emerged, and then hopefully just open it up to have some conversation. So as mentioned earlier, I'm originally from the west coast of Canada. I grew up on unceded Tsleil-Waututh territory, so just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, on a body of water known as the Indian Arm. And I grew up really close to the ocean, facing where the Kinder Morgan pipeline terminus is. And there's been a lot of activism by environmental groups and leaders from the Tsleil-Waututh community against the expansion of oil shipping through the port, with concerns about how it would affect that body of water. So I kind of grew up always facing this site, which has been a very contested site. I talk in the book a little bit about my first volunteer job as a beach keeper in informing visitors to Belcarra Regional Park about, crabs that were undersized and that need to be returned to the ocean as a sort of scrawny teenager. And so certainly this love and care for the environment and the ocean and the West Coast has really shaped who I am and the work that I've come to do. So I'm a non-Indigenous academic and mother who has taken a great care to learn about the environment. And I guess one of the moments that really deepened my own learning in this area was as a PhD student. So at the University of Ottawa, back in 2010, when I started my research working with the Aamjiwnaang Nation, who is affected to this day in really devastating ways by the emittance of different chemicals into the environment. And so as a PhD student, I started to learn more and more about Indigenous rights and perspectives and relationships. And so that has really informed my research. And that informed the book Everyday Exposure that was mentioned earlier. And then subsequently as a postdoc researcher at the University of Victoria later, I worked with the Ottawa-Gatineau Nation, which led to the book on life against states of emergency. So I'm someone who's been really perplexed with and troubled by emergency declarations in various contexts, including environmental conditions. And so the heat dome, the 2021 heat dome, is one that hit me really, really personally. So I tried to really complement my sort of academic scholarly brain with my personal life experience of becoming a mother in 2021. So after completing my studies and I had relocated back to Canada after starting my first academic position overseas in Hawaii. I had recently moved back to the West Coast and started my current job. And so I sort of a year after that became a mother and really struggled with breastfeeding, extreme dehydration, ended up in the emergency room. So some of you may know this already if you've read some of the excerpts from the Code Red chapter. So this was a really, really challenging event for the province of British Columbia, where we, I think, around the world took note of this event and realized just how much the climate emergency is a matter of life and death for human life, but then also for non-human or more than human life, including sort of, human deaths as well as sea creatures. So 619 human deaths reported, and then over 1 billion sea creature deaths. So it was really, really, really a terrible summer in many ways. And I talk about this sort of bittersweet tone in the book of, the joy of becoming a mother, and then the sort of fear of what it means to bring a new being into this world that, was on fire, was burning. It was the same here that the town of Lytton, BC burned to the ground. And then the flooding led to another state of emergency. So it was a sort of triple threat of state of emergencies that year that my son came into the world. So we saw record-breaking temperatures across the province, and we keep seeing record-breaking temperatures worldwide. But one of the other concerns that I, became really aware of and that I'm concerned about in my current research and writing is also about how some communities, some groups are disproportionately affected by extreme weather events. So I was approached by community planners in the city of Victoria in the Capital Regional District, where I live, to do some research about this topic of how vulnerable groups are affected in relation to other different groups. And so I'll talk about that in just a moment, of how kind of my own lived experience led to doing research about different vulnerabilities. So at the same time of experiencing this heat dome in 2021, I also was going through the different emotions and challenges of becoming a new mother. And so this Atlantic article really, I think, resonated with me, called The Blurred Existence of Motherhood. And the image here, I think, really connects to how I certainly felt in those early days of, sleepless nights, trying to find your routines, trying to find your sense of self and identity, all of that while grappling with converging crises. So the pandemic was still in sort of the height of it, becoming a parent, climate change, dealing with these states of emergencies. It's just sort of felt like crisis after crisis, and carrying this in your body. And so for me, I've always been someone who writes to process pain or trauma, and so certainly hot mess is a result of that. And so the one gift that my son gave to me was being a great sleeper, and so would have 2 naps a day and sleep through the night fairly early on. And so during some of those nap times, I would take notes and journal, and that led to a book proposal and ultimately hot mess. So that was the sort of saving grace, I think, that he offered to me. But I think about hot mess as a kind of metaphor for the global conditions in terms of the environment and the code red emergency that we're seeing, but then also how I certainly felt as a new mother for the first time, trying to figure out how to navigate multiple identities and responsibilities and care for this new being while trying to sort of figure out how to be healthy and well all at the same time. So the 2021 heat dome, as mentioned, was a really formative moment for me. When I returned to work after parental leave, which was January 2022, pretty much the same, if not that month, the next month after, I was approached and I felt like a taxi cab in terms of my light was on. And so I was approached. I thought, yes, I want to do research about this. So it started a new area of research for me about how extreme weather events affect vulnerable groups. And so I currently do research about how the perspectives of vulnerable groups during extreme weather events can better inform policy. And so it started really locally in Victoria and in the Capital Regional District with trying to understand the experiences of seniors living in isolation, of newcomers to the area, and then also those with perinatal lived experience. So those who are pregnant or nursing who contributed their thoughts to some sharing circle. So there's a few references to that in Hot Mess. So as I was back to work, I was doing that research and then also starting to write this Hot Mess book, which just came out last year. And I really wanted it to be an accessible book, a less academic book, and one that anybody could read that was interested in parenting, that maybe has a concern about the environment. And certainly For Our Kids is the perfect audience, I think, to engage with this kind of writing. And I think of my best childhood friend who was with me as a beach keeper, and she's somebody who herself is a mother, is a nurse, and I hope that people like her could pick up the book or listen to it. It will soon be an audiobook and relate to some of the ideas. So wanting to sort of stretch the boundaries of my writing. I tend to be a really academic writer with a lot of jargon and tried really hard to peel that away and write in a much more accessible way. So you can let me know if I succeeded. I'm not sure. I tried really hard. A work in progress. So some of the key arguments and concerns in the book are an examination through lived experience and my perspective of these cascading or converging crises, so multiple crises at once, highlighting how extreme weather events are not natural disasters, but they're symptomatic of our societal culture, which tends to have an over-reliance on extractive capitalism. And not just painting a doom and gloom picture, Hot Mess also really wants to suggest that we're living through a vital moment where we can rethink our relationships with our environments. And the core message is that we need to recenter care in how we relate to each other and our environments rather than just capitalism and extraction and property ownership and all these kinds of values that we hold as truth and sacred in our society. But care has been so undervalued. And so it really is sort of a plea to elevate how we think about care. And I recently started reading a book called Caring Democracy, which I wish I had read before writing this, because I think it picks up a lot of these themes. And there's a lot in conversation here about how care should inform our societal organizations, our values, our politics, our programs. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that in Q&A, but really it is trying to elevate how we consider care in our society. And then one of the sort of concluding arguments that you see in the final chapter or vignette around Code Gray is about renewable energy sources, highlighting how it's a bit of a cautionary tale because some of the processes involved in extracting minerals for batteries for electric vehicles and other parts, they still have harmful effects on environments and people. And so it's not the answer, even though I'm about to get a used EV and try to go in that direction and have those personal values as much as I can. It's not the answer. So there's a bit of a cautionary tale message there as well. Okay, so the way that the book is organized, it's organized around code. So it takes the BC hospital code system, and every chapter is a vignette that uses a code as a metaphor. So the very first one is Code Red, and that emerged because that was the year that UN officials declared that climate change and the climate emergency was a code red for humanity. So it just really spooked me to write and reflect about what it means to bring a new life into a code red sort of world on fire. So code red is known for fire, and so fire and heat are very connected in this chapter. And as mentioned before, this is a year that broke heat records around the world. So that's the very first chapter or vignette. And each vignette is paired with an illustration, which tries to sort of give a sense of the chapter as well. And I like the word vignette rather than chapter because they are stories and they're quite short as well. And the next vignette is Code Orange. So Code Orange is a hospital code for mass casualties or disasters. And I actually recall going to the hospital and seeing the Code Orange sign because hospitals were so overwhelmed with people coming to the emergency during the heat dome. So it sort of, for me, follows naturally to have Code Orange next because I vividly recall seeing those signs, Code Orange, in the hospital. So this vignette looks at different kinds of disasters, fast and slow, and looks at slow disasters of pollution and speaks to some of the work that I've done in Chemical Valley and highlights concerns around environmental violence and racism. And as I was finishing up writing this book, federally, the government in Canada was working towards the passage of a bill, which gave me some hope actually. Bill C-226, which did pass into law in June last year, and I had just been invited to speak with the Senate of Canada about it, advocating for the bill. And it was an important reminder that environmental violence and racism happens in Canada, and this bill would certainly help move in a better direction to try to prevent these contaminated and compromised sites from happening in the future. And so this vignette talks about relationship building and doing work with the Aamjiwnaang Nation in Chemical Valley. The next vignette is the most personal and was the one that I wrote first, actually. I just turned around because I think I may be here, Forrest behind me, my son. And so Code Pink, I wrote really trying to process a difficult birth. So Code Pink is the hospital code for a challenging birth, so a pediatric or obstetrical emergency. And this vignette draws upon a term that was shared with me by a Newtonos colleague, Dawn Smith, who writes about this in her writing. And so it was fresh in my mind what it means to sort of carry multiple emotions at once and process that. So process the pain of birth and the joy of a new life and the excitement but nervousness around becoming a parent. So this term yuckmas was just in the back of my mind as I was reflecting on my own really, really difficult birth experience. So moving forward, the next vignette is Code Blue, the hospital code for cardiac arrest. And so I really think of this chapter as a tone for heartache, heartache for the planetary situation, talk a bit about how oceans are affected. Oceans have always been dear to my heart, being a West Coaster and someone who also has lived in Hawaii. So some of the themes covered in this vignette are around mental health, reproductive health, and climate anxiety, and how often new parents are kind of carrying all of these concerns at once. And then Code Green follows, and Code Green is maybe the most hopeful in the sense that there are lots of alternatives that are gestured towards in this vignette. So hospital code green is for extraction, or sorry, for evacuation. So evacuating from status quo ideas, so trying to move in different directions. So one of the alternatives that is referenced quite a bit is the circular economy here. And I know that circular economies do not transform capitalism, but they are an alternative. They are better than not reusing. And so I think there are really wonderful efforts advanced in places like Hawaii, which I got to know about through my time as an academic there. So some of those movements are referenced in the book. So I talk about Aloha Aina Futures and a really inspiring feminist economic recovery plan. And so a lot of feminist scholars were coming together with economists and lawyers and creating these policy playbooks, highlighting how the pandemic could be a portal to think about alternative futures. And I just found it so exciting to think about. And as a public admin scholar, so I'm in the School of Public Administration, I often think about grounding ideas in sort of governance and policy and practice. So for me, that was really helpful. And as a teacher too, I want to expose students to other ways of thinking so that they know that other worlds are possible. We just have to think about alternatives, and when there are alternatives, think about what that might mean in practice. So I get quite excited by the Code Green vignette. So Code Black follows, which is really one of the most difficult ones. It's the hospital code for a bomb threat. This vignette talks about violence and enduring forms of structural violence, and again picks up on the theme of environmental violence and racism that was introduced in Code Orange. Oh, I think I maybe skipped one. Oh, I realized I didn't go over Code Gray as much as I wanted to. I highlighted in the beginning just to mention that Code Gray is a chapter that is one of the shorter ones, and it also highlights concerns with places like the Ring of Fire, for instance, in Northern Ontario, where some of the communities that I got to know, like Attawapiskat, for instance, have some concerns about the sort of push to extract critical minerals for renewable resources. And so there's some caution about the renewable renaissance in this chapter. And so there's this kind of bittersweet tone in that final vignette. And then after that is the conclusion, which I call prismatic reflections, and try to sort of blur some of these codes and then offer some insights for how to move forward. So that's how the book ends. I don't want to give it all away in case some of you haven't yet had a chance to read it. And if you do prefer listening rather than reading the book, certainly the audiobook might be of interest, which I think will be released on January 28th. And I do have my contact information here if you want to stay in touch with my email. And I'm currently still on X, although I have some mixed feelings about being on that platform. But these are currently the ways to be in touch. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks so much. It's so helpful to kind of give everyone the landscape of the book. I know some folks here have read it. Some people maybe are partway through it. Some people haven't read it. So I hope that kind of gets us all on the same page. And I think you actually kind of touched on some of the things I was going to ask about already. So this is helping me narrow down my huge list of questions. So maybe we could start with this idea about care. So care is so central to the book. And you talk about placing care at the center of our economic and political lives, which is interesting because, probably usually when people think about care, we think about interpersonal relations, we think about maybe, smaller spheres, but you're talking about care in economics, care in politics. I was wondering if you can give some more examples about what does that look like to center care in economics and in politics?
Yeah, thank you so much. And if everyone wants another book, definitely that Care Democracy book by Joan Tronto is a really good follow-up that takes that concept into such detail at a conceptual level, but I think also practically. And that's an American author, and I almost feel like they need that message a little bit more in the US even than in Canada. But I think of things like childcare. So I'm really lucky in BC where actually when Forrest was first going to daycare, there wasn't the $10 a day program. He didn't have access to that program, and now he does because there are more facilities like that. So care in terms of like offering childcare for parents so that they can work if they choose to work. For me, that's one really concrete way in which care can be central. It can enhance economic relations. I think it gets a little bit unfortunate if there's this binary created between like economic prosperity and care. I think they actually can really go well together. And we're certainly grateful to have access to good care. Um, and I can speak from my own experience as someone who has worked in Hawaii in sort of US context and then in the Canadian context. And it's a completely different policy landscape for working parents. So in at the University of Hawaii Manoa, for instance, there wasn't parental leave. It was like unpaid for I think up to 12 weeks you could have. It's quite different in Canada. And so I recall colleagues saying, it's okay, you can just teach online when you're on parental leave. And I thought, well, that's still working. That's not really the same as leave and spending time with your child. And so having policies in place like paid parental leave, paid childcare, these are all really important and they also enhance the economy. So these are some examples, I think, of how care can be central. And I'm starting to take a lot of notice in political language and rhetoric too, what gets upheld in our society, what values we hold up. And um, there's just so much emphasis on like accumulation of wealth rather than like redistribution of wealth and caring for others. So I do feel quite fortunate to live in Canada, where I think compared to what I have experienced and observed in the US, it's the wealth disparity is so much more stark in certain ways. Even how like teachers are compensated, it's completely different in Hawaii than it is in British Columbia. So I think centering care, education, compassion, centering these kinds of values conceptually, but then also in really practical policy ways is imperative. So I think about it conceptually and then also in these kind of practical policy ways as well. But like you said earlier, it is also about relationships and how we care for one another. And it's not something that I feel like an expert at actually, like how to be caring in the workplace is something that I'm, working on and trying to be a good colleague and collegial, and of course in my family life. So I think care is something that is just sometimes just treated as not central or it's outsourced or it's not part of our like core values as a society. And that's really what I want to see differently. I want to see more care for care at the center of our societal life.
I wonder if we could even go back to really basics, and I'm curious how you would define care.
Yeah. Well, I think of care as sort of relationships that go beyond the individual self. I think that is authentically how I consider care. And in my mind, I do think of it quite in contrast to sort of capital, which I see as kind of like an object or something that's instrumentalized or this sort of something that we use like a commodity for extraction. So I really think of it much more as a relationship that goes beyond just one person. And it requires acknowledging that we're in relation to one another, to our environments, like plants, animals, the kind of more than human environment too. So think of it as a relationship. I know that there are certain transactional relations, like going to daycare, you pay for a service. But I personally do think of care as in a bit more of a broader sense.
Um, Somewhere in the book, you talk about how care is both personal and radical.
Mhm.
And yeah, hearing how you're describing that, I can understand that better, that it can be a radical political act when it's an active, I guess, challenge to much of the things that are problematic about the status quo.
Mhm. And I think a lot about even like workplace cultures. A lot of places are very hierarchical and top down and strategic, and it's kind of like bargaining and transactional to sort of advance a career, a sense of self. And it's not often about like caring for someone's future. So I think of care in such a much more like horizontal way, perhaps trying to hold each other up. And I love this really simple book called Gardens of Democracy. And I used to use it for teaching sort of introductory courses. And it just makes a simple argument like we're all better off when we're all better off, like when we support each other, when we're not just looking out for ourselves. And so that's where I see it as quite radical. I wish it wasn't radical. Care is a simple word. It shouldn't have to be radical, but it feels that way when I look at sort of dominant political culture, unfortunately.
What would you say for people who feel like, that really resonates, that's the sort of culture they want to help strengthen, but who feel like if if some of the people with the most power in our world, perhaps due to, their position in government or perhaps due to their amount of wealth, are benefiting so much from the status quo that they want to actively, undermine creating an alternative. I know this is a tricky question, but yeah, what would you say to someone who is thinking of that when they hear this?
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely think a lot about politics. My PhD is in political studies, and my previous teaching appointments have been in political science. And so I can't help but think about politics and leadership and organizing. And I'm worried about dominant political culture, like many sort of critical ecofeminists are, and I self-identify as a critical ecofeminist, and that's what motivated the um, emergence of FERN, the Feminist Environmental Research Network. And so I think cultivating community is so critical. That's why it's really wonderful to meet so many people from For Our Kids and to see the emergence of community, because I also like I think about care, I think about community as quite radical, and it shouldn't be. Again, like care and community are simple terms, but they are so radical because they're such a challenge to extractive capitalism. Um, and so I share concern with dominant political culture, and I found myself glued to the news recently with all of the different elections we've seen. So in BC, we had an election recently, in the US, another election, and it was I was drinking too much wine, definitely needed the sort of dry January this month. And I was getting quite excited and concerned at the same time because I actually live in a riding where we have one of the only federal Green MPs in Canada. So I live in Elizabeth May's riding, and I'm very inspired by the work that Elizabeth May does. And I got to meet her when I was at the Senate of Canada hearings on Bill C-226 last year. And so I was kind of watching with a lot of keen interest the BC election, and it shifted a little bit in a more populist conservative direction. But I was so intrigued by the leader, the Green Party leader, and sort of the tone and the values and the emphasis on like community health centers. And so I found myself really excited about some aspects of dominant political culture, even though it's a minority party, of course, the Green Party provincially. Um, so yeah, again, always I feel like life is just this, you're constantly holding these multiple emotions and realities at the same time. And so I still maintain some curiosity and hope and optimism about sort of the green movement, green politics, structurally and more informally. But I also have a lot of like concern about what we're seeing in terms of like global populist right-wing politics. So that was a long-winded way of acknowledging those concerns, but then also saying I do feel some hope in community and coming together. And I know it might sound like a really simple thing again, but I do really think that voting matters. And in Hawaii, there's a representative that just got elected, a young women with really progressive values, super excited to see that as well. And so I think that leadership and representation, it does really matter. And so I do believe that.
If we could pivot uh, towards your experience of motherhood, um,
Mhm.
and you mentioned in the presentation about the concept of yuckness, holding multiple emotions
Mhm.
and tension, and how that was helpful for you in processing the grief of a challenging birth and bringing your baby into the climate emergency. Could you talk more about that concept and why you find it supportive?
Mhm. Yeah, I think part of it was being able to have some language around a really traumatic experience. And it was interesting speaking with um, my colleague Rachel George, who wrote the foreword to the book, who's also a Newtonist, and we had some interesting discussions around sort of the ethics of a non-Newtonist person like myself using this concept in a book to talk about like out of context situations, like my situation, how I feel, and kind of the ethics of it, um, and what we sort of landed on is that when doing that can be problematic is if you're sort of saying this is the way to understand this term or this like as an authoritative voice, that's quite dangerous and problematic. But what is sort of um, more appropriate is acknowledging how a term influenced me process and experience or an event. So it's kind of like an interpretive act. So I always want to be really cautious when I talk about that term, just to not um, come across as yeah that authoritative voice or having the answers on the best way to interpret it. But I will say, for me personally, this concept speaks to a sort of a Newtonian experience of love and pain. And so going through a really, really difficult birth, as I talk about in Code Pink, it was like this loss of control, loss of agency, loss of consciousness, frankly. And so trying to process all of that, I'll process the like grief and loss of this plan, this sort of birth plan that I had envisioned, and then all of a sudden just quickly step into the responsibility of caregiving and being a parent. And so it was kind of like holding grief, like this was not what I had planned, this was not what I expected. Um, I don't even remember Forrest's first like cry. I wasn't there. I was, unconscious. And so that was really difficult to grapple with and come to terms with. Um, but then you have to sort of carry on and be responsible and nurture this being. And so I found that term helpful for reminding me about struggle and going through pain and how there's beauty on the other side of pain and that pain and beauty can be related to one another. And that I suppose what also resonated with me is about how that term challenges dualistic ways of thinking. So often in Western society, we create these like black and white, his and her, like these binaries. And so the Yakmas term sort of blurs those divisive ways of thinking about how we relate to each other in the world. So I found a lot of kind of solace in the term.
Just looking at the time, I think we'll move to the audience questions soon. So if folks want to start writing that in the chat, feel free. And uh, while that's happening, again, not an easy question, but Sarah, I'm curious about, you warn, you caution about the use of critical minerals for the clean energy transition. You're not saying don't do it, but you're saying, how can we do this with great care? Like how can we do this with great awareness? Um, I don't know if there are any easy answers, but yeah, I wanted to give you time to maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think part of what was motivating, and to lose my voice when I talk too much, which is a signal you need to listen more. But I think what was motivating my writing about that, and it's still a topic that I really care about, and I want to do a little more research in that area too. So I will say it's an emergent area, again, not one that I feel like an expert on, but I think a lot of our sort of green energy transition policies, they put a lot of pressure on consumers. So it's like you as the consumer can solve this through, recycling, composting, which are all really important. And I do these things with great enthusiasm. Buying the EV, the heat pump, all of these are sort of put forward as strategies, which are certainly important. I wouldn't say that they're not important, but I just don't think they're the answer with like a capital T. I think that putting pressure on consumers is only part of the solution. And so, like as I mentioned, I myself am just in the process of I'm going to purchase a used EV for our family. So it's not that we shouldn't use electric vehicles or uh, move away from a reliance on fossil fuels. It's that I think we need broader structural change as well. So we need, again, that care, that radical care. We need like care-based policies and programs. We need to redistribute wealth. And it's part of why I was so attracted to sort of the recent green policy platform about, how tax systems work, about having community centers of care and health centers. So I think we need much more holistic ways to address climate change than just the consumer response. And so a heat pump is another good example of something that is held up as a solution in policy, certainly in provincial policy. And right around the time I started doing heat wave research about vulnerability, some of the planners that I spoke with in the district were expressing some frustration because what if you're not a homeowner and you don't have a heat pump? How do you deal with the extreme heat? Where are the safe spaces to go? And just going to a shelter is not the answer. It might be the answer during a crisis, but it's not the answer to um, you know, larger systemic radical change. And so the that vignette has that cautionary tale, just almost like don't be complacent. Don't think that just getting the EV or the heat pump will make everything okay, because there are still bigger concerns, and we need to be vigilant and still try to look for broader, more systemic change at structural, economic, societal, political level. So I think that's what was really motivating that sort of cautionary ethic, and also because I had been working with members of the Ottawa-Gatineau Nation and leadership there expressing care about the Ring of Fire, and also issues of respecting Indigenous rights, and noting that you know a lot of mining has affected certain communities for diamonds and other kinds of products, and I'm worried or share some concern about renewables kind of being the new extractive material that doesn't respect those rights as well. So I think there are a few layers of concern motivating that sort of that caution. So yeah, it's really trying to note that individual behavior is important, but so is community action, societal action, political action at all levels as well.
One of the notes that I made was towards the end of the book, you write, rather than assuming individual responsibility for the well-being of ourselves and future generations, we should find solace and power in community and collective struggle. And you reference bell hooks, talking about love and love as a social phenomenon. I don't know where I'm going with that, but that was another thing that I noted in the book. So before we move over to the Q&A, I wanted to ask you a question um, that Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, in her new book, What If We Get It Right? So it's a series of interviews with folks working on climate change in all different sectors. Great book, and I think really complementary to yours, and that it is about envisioning alternative futures. And a question that she asks everyone she interviews is, from your perspective, so for you, from your perspective as an ecofeminist, as a mother, as a community engaged researcher who's done a lot of work with Indigenous communities and I think is quite informed by Indigenous worldviews. What do you think it would look like to get it right, and how we respond to climate change? Either, as a global community, or you could think of it in a more local context. But what comes to what do you envision when you think about that?
Yeah. I keep thinking a lot about power relations and restructuring those relations. And so, and I see some comments in the chat a little bit about this tension of like revolutionary action and then like sort of traditional, more institutional politics. But getting it right for me does look like radically transforming our systems of governance. And so when I see um, people like Jody Wilson-Raybould or other sort of Indigenous leaders or other maybe queer or diverse leaders in positions of power, I get quite excited because I know that they will move our values into more progressive directions and quite often bring attention to issues that have been so ignored and silenced. And so for me, getting it right is about transforming those kind of hierarchical, top-down status quo modes of relating. Um, Part of what I think about when I think what are eco-feminist or critical eco-feminist values, it's not just about drawing attention to care for the environment, but it is about highlighting inequities of power relations. And so it is hard because when you look at something like Parliament or Senate, they are very colonial institutions, and there's been so many leaders who have, removed themselves because they're not welcoming safe spaces. So we need really, really radical change in those institutions. And so I do think getting it right is, electing different leaders, leaders with different ideas, electing leaders that care about the environment, that have progressive, inclusive, community, values-based solutions. I think it's about creating these communities of change. Like For Our Kids is really exciting to see because it is building community. It's creating these conversations. So yeah, getting it right is cultivating space for community to come together to express um, changes in values. I think electing leaders that can translate that into policy, that for me is getting it right, and not being complacent. I know I'm sure a lot of people who are here today are not complacent, so I don't want to come across as patronizing or saying things that you probably already know very, very well. And yeah, I think part of it's also creating spaces for conversations, which I'm not always great at. And my own family, and people have really, really different, like almost Republican, very conservative values. It's very hard to have conversations. So I think getting there sometimes is like going on a hike or going surfing or doing something in the environment and trying to like activate that care at a really visceral level and then building out from there. Um, One last thing I'll say maybe, and it's a story that I like to share, is while doing research about extreme heat, we did sharing circles with different groups. And so part of that, the goal is to get people to share about their experiences. And so we did a few with senior citizens, and they, of course, a range of ideological perspectives. And I remember doing one um, sharing circle where there was an elderly gentleman who was quite annoyed that I was there doing a study, doing a survey, and was handing out the consent form. And he sort of threw it back and said, "Oh, I don't believe in climate change. I don't want to participate." I said, "No problem. This is totally voluntary. You're welcome to have the free lunch and leave. You don't even have to stay today." But he did stay and listen to my sort of introductory spiel. And I went up and said, "I'm a new mother. This is why I'm doing this research. I had this experience." And the story that I shared, it captivated him. And he stayed and he participated. He signed the form. At the end, he said, "Oh, now I understand why you're doing this, and you're doing a good thing." I thought, wow, that was a whole, like, that was just in 1 hour, that turnaround. And it's such a small story, but it really sticks with me because it made me believe in the power of storytelling. And it is really hard though, because it's hard to be vulnerable and open about your weaknesses and things that didn't go well for you. I don't really like talking about, well, being in the ER, and it's just very uncomfortable and sad, and it is hard to share those stories and spaces. But I will say it did unlock something in that particular individual, and it created a bit of a shared understanding. And so I think getting it right is also about creating spaces for exchange of ideas where you can safely communicate. But it's hard. It's hard to do. It's something that I try to do as a teacher, and I try to do as sort of a colleague and a parent. But I'm always working on it. There's a lot of room to improve that.
So it's this like engaging in multiple spheres, like the very personal sphere and telling our
Mhm.
personal stories, connecting with our local communities and making them stronger, and then also being engaged citizens at the
Mhm.
political level.
I think so. And also, the hard part is getting people in positions of power to listen. I think that's the thing. Like we can engage, but how do we get people to listen and then transform? And some of my colleagues at the University of Victoria, they're part of something called the Climate Disaster Project, which would be a good one to pop in the chat if anyone's interested. An environmental storytelling group community, and so my colleagues they go all around the province and even more broadly and interview people who have experienced different climate disaster events like Lytton, BC, and other places. And I've been invited to work with them on a project that involved a theater production. And so we put together a theater production and invited policymakers to come and listen and witness and be part of sharing talkback sessions after. So that was really neat, I think, in terms of using arts to create dialogue and then have people in positions of power. We had people running for office and mayors come and listen and engage in dialogue. So I think that's maybe one way you can engage in listening. Um, so I'm hopeful again about trying to create more spaces like that, spaces of like really well curated listening that involve our kind of emotional selves and the arts and um, yeah, have that exchange. But again, the challenge is getting people from different backgrounds together. So I know there are things like climate assemblies. I would actually really like to see something like a climate assembly in Canada and British Columbia. I know they're popular in the UK and other places, but those are spaces where you have people like citizens coming together and talking about their solutions. So I would certainly like to see more of that as well.
This is a nice lead into one of the questions from the audience. So I'll just read it. Um, So it says, you bring forth the value of community care and highlight the challenges of political will and action being often a barrier to seeing better lives for all. I often hear and align with the concept that what can be helpful is to bring the environmental activist goals to the eyes of those more in control of the means of production, and they say, for example, unions. Do you have any suggestions about effective means to initiate those dialogues or thoughts about which unions or other groups might be most open to aligning their needs with that of environmentalism?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question about like labor movements, environmental movements, and bringing people together. I think there has been some good strategies historically of different groups coming together. When I think of Chemical Valley, that's an interesting one actually, where um, there have been like different labor movements and environmental groups and not necessarily always working well together. You know, unions working to protect workers' rights and then separate organizing outside. But that kind of organizing has also ebbed and flowed. There have been different moments where they work together and others where they don't. Um, but I think something like climate assembly is interesting because it would ideally bring together people from all kinds of backgrounds. So, environmentalists, people from the labor movement or unions, as well as citizens that maybe don't have any knowledge of climate events or emergencies. And so I think that formal organizing is certainly important, and really, really essential. But then I also think it is not that it's more important, but perhaps equally important to have constructive spaces for those who don't often have a voice or platform or maybe feel marginalized in society, have them contribute in some way. And I believe that's what's kind of leading to the rise in populism. People feel like they're not being heard. And so I think we need more spaces to have people exchange and be heard. But the problem is when there are certain values that become dominant, and that can be really problematic. So I would just simply say that I think taking note of labor, environmental movements, and organizing formally is really, really important, and is certainly an important strategy for change. But also our kind of average citizen voices who may not be formally affiliated with any groups too, because I think there are so many that are feeling alienated. And I realized this from watching news coverage of the recent US election. A lot of people, and it just blew my mind how they could be sort of behind the current president, frankly. But they just feel like that represents them, or they're not feeling heard. They feel like this person will make them feel heard. And so I think structurally we need to think about that. How can we make people feel heard and provide education so that they're making informed decisions? This is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but one more thing that I do want to say on that is that it has also got me thinking about how spaces of education can be really transformative, and they need to be more accessible as well. And so I think when like the cost of education is high, that is a challenge for people getting information about the environment or about other issues. And so I would also advocate for making education free, if we could do that, like happens in other countries in Scandinavia, for instance.
Reading your book has made me understand more clearly something I've often heard climate justice advocates say, but that I was still a bit sticky for me, but around how, advocating for things like, uh, yeah, tuition-free post-secondary education, or for like affordable childcare, or affordable housing, how that there's an argument to be made how that falls under the banner of climate work, that all kinds of social justice work is quite connected to climate work because it is part of building this and strengthening this alternative to the status quo that needs to be strong in order to make these other changes.
Mm-hmm.
One question that I think you've partially addressed, but I'll ask it in case you have more thoughts on it. So, a question from the audience was, do you see the change away from extractive capitalism as coming through current political systems, or rather through something more like a revolution? As you mentioned, the leaders benefit from the current system, so how will it change? Yeah, any more thoughts on that?
Well, one other thing that I would add is I get really excited when I see like youth leadership or young leaders, and I'm privileged to be part of a research project about climate displacement in the Arctic. So, specifically working with community members from Tuktoyaktuk, and there's a lot of beautiful artists and storytellers and musicians that are speaking up and out about their concerns about relocation. So there is pressure that they're going to have to move their community because of climate change and like the melt in the permafrost, the changes to the sea ice, all of that, how it's the sea level rise, all that's really affecting where they live. And so again, I want to go back to the point about listening, and I think creating these structural spaces of listening is so important. And I was actually pretty encouraged to be in Ottawa at it was the Arctic Net conference just in December, and there were federal policymakers, like civil servants there listening to these youth leaders. They were performing rap music, hip hop songs, and sharing stories about their everyday observations and experiences. And it was so beautiful to see the civil servants listening, and they're trying to take notes and like report on that and their kind of like scientific evidence. And yeah, so it wasn't a perfect experience. There were some challenges in like how do you communicate this back to your higher ups to lead to transformative change. But I definitely left with a sense of appreciation to see those civil servants trying to account for that evidence and that knowledge. So not a revolution. It's not sort of coming from the top down, but it's somewhere in the middle there where it's these civil servants that really, really care, that are, scientists and working for, I think it was NRCan, Natural Resource Canada, wanting to create space for these youth voices in their reporting. But of course, the questions are like, who reads the reports and that kind of thing. But that's where the elected officials come in because if we vote for people that will take this reporting seriously, that's really important. So I guess I am falling back a bit on the structural side of things rather than the more revolutionary. But I will say that we need all of it. I recall, when working really closely with Amjadong in the Sarnia Chemical Valley area, there were often blockades of the rail line, toxic tours, all kinds of social mobilization to raise awareness about elevated rates of benzene and states of emergency. And so you need that kind of on the ground mobilization, absolutely. So I wouldn't discount that at all. I think I feel a sense of responsibility as a public admin professor to sort of shift my gaze to structural forms of power and to try to highlight injustices that way. But I think we certainly need both, need change from both levers.
One question that came after the book club, so folks from For Our Kids Toronto and For Our Kids Ottawa organized a book club about hot mess. And one of the questions was about how you talk about emergencies. So the person said, I'm interested in her thoughts on slow emergencies, because you talk about slow emergencies and fast
Mhm.
emergencies. Um, I'm interested in her thoughts on slow emergencies and how we as parents and advocates can use the state of emergency, like declaring a climate crisis, to actually make change happen.
Yeah. And it's interesting. In British Columbia in 2021, there were three provincial state of emergencies. They weren't really framed as climate emergencies necessarily. So I do think that reframing is interesting and would be really powerful. Perhaps part of the challenge is that the language of climate, it's still alienating, unfortunately, for people who don't believe or take climate change to be as serious or pressing or visceral or of concern. Um, so rhetorically, it raises the question of like, is it strategically useful to declare something like that, climate emergency, or does that lose that political traction? But personally, I think it would make sense for my personal values. But I suppose from a politician's perspective, where they're trying to get reelected and appeal to a broad electoral base, um, some who may not believe in climate change, um, worse might be coming. I think that it might not be seen as strategic, but I think it's accurate and fair and authentic to refer to these events as climate emergencies. I certainly do refer to them as that. I'm really watching what's happening in LA with a lot of focus and intensity to see if that shifts sort of political culture more broadly around recognition and awareness of the climate emergency and climate emergency events that we're facing with warmer temperatures and effects on plant life and susceptibility to fires. Come on in for us. And so I do think it is important. Um, and I would like to see leaders that have the confidence to declare these things as climate emergencies, certainly. Yeah, my meandering comments there are more so just kind of speculating on why I think there's that hesitancy.
Mhm.
I'm working on this project right now about trying to understand access to safe space for vulnerable groups during extreme weather events. And I wanted to refer to the focus groups or sort of town hall meetings as climate cafes or climate conversations. And one of the postdoctoral researchers that I'm working with, it's from the US, and was like, I think that language will alienate people. Like people won't show up if you call it a climate cafe. So we're going to try care, calling them like care circles, and care standing for like um, community action and responses to extreme weather events. And we'll see if care gets people or not. I'm not sure if that is any more inviting for certain populations, but all that to say, unfortunately, climate is also still seen as one of those words that turns off a lot of people. So I wish it wasn't the case, but so I think we need to use it more and make it more comfortable and realistic. And I look at what's happening in LA and think, how can you not realize that this is a climate emergency? But I'm not even seeing that much linkage with that framing in mainstream media actually, or well, yeah, and definitely not from elite level discourse. So I think linking these events to climate emergencies is important. It's not quite happening in mainstream discourse and media like it needs to.
But you think it would be of value for advocates to
I
put it.
think so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
In our last few minutes, I wanted to check in with the group in the room in Ottawa. I don't know if you have access to the chat. Would you, did you get a chance to ask the questions that you want? You can give me a wave. I can see you. We all good? Because I did want to invite, oh yeah, go ahead. I see you're off mute.
We had one in the chat already, and
You had one in the chat. Oh, great. Okay.
but
Awesome.
we had a lot, but we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and Jinwa for this great discussion.
Thank you so much for gathering there. That's so wonderful.
I popped in the chat just another resource. Because as I was reflecting and writing this book, I was reading everything I could about parenting and climate change, and have almost like a I could probably create a syllabus now of like recommended reading. But this one book and group, Conceivable Future, is really wonderful. It is US based, and one of the authors was an elected representative, perhaps still is an elected representative. So they speak from their vantage point as parents, as activists with formal and informal positions, and talk about how they navigate parenting and climate change. And it's very well written and useful, and I think it connects with what we're seeing in Canada as well. So I would recommend that book and that organization for future reference.
It's a good moment also to so when Sarah and I were preparing for this conversation, I'd asked you if there were any organizations or initiatives, to use this conversation to share about and invite people to learn about and support. So you did share three that we'll put into the chat, and will get sent out in the follow-up email. So I don't know if you want to like speak really briefly about them, give a little overview of what they are.
Yeah, I can really quickly. I put three organizations at different scales. So one is really, really local, Papak and Hout. It also means Blossoming Place. It's a local nonprofit in British Columbia in the Science Peninsula area, and they do a lot of land-based ecological restoration. And they work right outside of Butchart Gardens, which is like a really celebrated colonial garden destination. It's beautiful. I've gone with my family, but this nonprofit is working so hard right next door to remove invasive species and bring back native plants. So I've taken students there for land-based learning and really like to elevate that group and the work that they're doing for the environment. Shannon's Dream, I also mentioned. The book that I wrote about life against states of emergency with Attawapiskat, all of the royalties go to Shannon's Dream to support Indigenous access to education. And the third organization, I'm forgetting now what I wrote, but I know there was a third one that I offered. Which one did I put again? Oh, there it is, right there. Perfect. Oh, Ho'ola'aina. So, because so many of the community groups and stories and vignettes and policy recommendations, that many of the examples in Hot Mess draw from Hawaii. I wanted to also include Ho'oluaina, which is this amazing organization in Kaliki Valley. And they do similar to Pacific How land-based ecological restoration, revitalizing native plants, but they also have a wellness center. So it's a really holistic space centering Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli values, trying to cultivate love and care for the environment. So you have a local, national, and global organization there, all three offered that you can learn more about.
Oh, thank you so much. I see we're a minute over time. Want to respect everybody's time. I'll let you know that, yeah, as Sarah mentioned, Hot Mess will be released in audiobook soon, January 28th in 10 days. And one of the places where you can access it is through a company called Libro. And this is an app that gives a portion of the sale back to a local bookstore of your choosing, which is a neat way to do it. And we can pop the chat for Libro in there, and also a link for you can use to see if Hot Mess is at a local bookshop near you. And of course, there's always the library, wonderful part of our society. Um, and lastly, I know that, parenting and climate change, those themes, there's, an inherent deep intensity to that. I want to recognize I have a 7-year-old. I feel that very much. So I also wanted to include, if Wayan, you could add to the chat, there's a really great climate mental health resource library that you can access online. So we'll pop that in the chat. And I've also included a link about how to talk to kids about the climate crisis, and that comes from Our Kids Climate, which is an international group of parents, grandparents, and caregivers taking climate action. So all of those links will be in the follow-up email as well. So much gratitude to you, Sarah, for your time and energy, and for folks who joined and listened, folks who asked their questions. Thank you, Wayan, for all your tech support for this call. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. So delighted to connect with everyone. I'm also taking note of those resources you just mentioned, and hope that we have the opportunity to stay in touch. And I look forward to the follow-up email with all the references and resources too. Thank you.